The movement of carrying forward the form of its self-knowledge is the labor which it accomplishes as actual history. The religious community, so far as it is at first the substance of absolute spirit, is the uncultivated consciousness whose existence is all the harsher and more barbarous the deeper its inner spirit is, and the deeper its spirit is, the harder the task that its torpid self has with its essence, with the alien content of its consciousness. Not until consciousness has given up hope of overcoming that alienation in an external that is alien manner does it turn to itself, because the overcoming of that alienation is the return into self-consciousness. Not until then does it turn to its own present world and discover it as its property, thus taking the first step towards coming down out of the intellectual world, or rather towards quickening the abstract element of that world with the actual self. Through observation, it finds on the one hand existence in the shape of thought and comprehends it, and conversely in its thinking it comprehends existence. When to begin with, it has thus expressed the immediate unity of thought and being, the unity of abstract essence in the self abstractly. And when it has expressed the primal light in a purer form, that is, as unity of extension and being. For extension is the simple unity which more nearly resembles pure thought than light does, and in doing so has revived in thought the substance of the Orient. Spirit at once recoils in horror from the abstract unity, from this selfless substantiality, and against it affirms individuality. But only after it has externalized this individuality in the sphere of culture, thereby giving it an existence and establishing it throughout the whole of existence, only after spirit has arrived at the thought of utility and in its absolute freedom has grasped existence as its will, only then does it turn the thought of its inmost depths outward and enunciate essence as I equals I. But this I equals I is the movement which reflects itself into itself. For since this identity, being absolute negativity, is absolute difference, the self-identity of the I stands over against this pure difference, which as pure and at the same time objective to the self-knowing self, has to be expressed as time. So that just as previously essence was declared to be the unity of thought and extension, it would now have to be grasped as the unity of thought and time. But the difference left to itself, unresting and unhalting time, collapses rather within itself. It is the objective repose of extension, while extension is pure identity with itself, the I. In other words, the I is not merely the self, but the identity of the self with itself. But this identity is complete and immediate otherness, immediate oneness with self, or this subject is just as much substance. Substance just by itself would be intuition devoid of content, or the intuition of a content which as determinate would be only accidental and would lack necessity. Substance would pass for the absolute only insofar as it was thought or intuited as absolute unity, and all content would, as regards its diversity, have to fall outside of it into reflection. And reflection does not pertain to substance, because substance would not be subject, would not be grasped as reflecting on itself, and reflecting itself into itself would not be grasped as spirit. If a content were to be spoken of anyway, it would, on the one hand, only be spoken of in order to cast it into the empty abyss of the absolute, and on the other, it would be a content picked up in external fashion from sense perception. Knowledge would seem to have come by things, by what is different from itself, and by the difference of a variety of things, without comprehending how and whence they came. Paragraph 803 is one of the longer paragraphs in Hegel's Phenomenology. There's a lot going on in there. And I thought, maybe I should break it into two commentary videos as I did earlier on for a paragraph that spanned 2 pages of the Miller translation, but I decided we'll see if we can pack it all into one single commentary. And there is a lot to pack in. So this might be a longer discussion than usual. And I want to begin at the start with this interesting phrase, the movement, the Bewegung, right, of carrying forward, of bringing things to the end, the form of its self-knowledge. So knowledge of what the self is. And we're going to see this discussed quite a bit in terms of the I equals I, which sounds, almost tautological, empty, as we're going to see. Hegel will talk about an abyss in just a bit, but it turns out to be quite robust. Now, there's a trap that we can fall into, which we'll talk about in a bit. So self-knowledge. Remember that for Hegel, in general, self-knowledge is not just a kind of navel-gazing or thought-thinking itself, if we want to use the formulation from Aristotle's Metaphysics in its bare sense. Self-knowledge is also associated with action, with choice, with, as we're going to see in just a moment, an engagement with the world of actuality. And here, Hegel is going to use a term that he hasn't for quite a while. He's going to talk about carrying this forward is the labor, the Arbeit, right, which it accomplishes as what? So he uses this term, actual history, wirkliche Geschichte. So Geschichte is history, right? And wirklich means actual, real, something where we've done something. And we're going to see, discussion about individuality coming up here as well. And we're always, we could say, immersed, whether we realize it or not, in actual history. We often don't realize it. A little bit of a pun there, since to become real is part of what Wirklichkeit is about. So this is where we're going. Now you notice he's not going to use this term, history, in the rest of this paragraph. You might say, well, why not? Well, he is going to talk about time, right? And he is going to talk about certain developments that have taken place within the phenomenology. And the first place he's going to start is with the religious community, the Gemeine, that we encountered back in the religion section. I think with these remarks about the religious community here, we have to understand it in a double way. So on the one hand, where does religion come up thematically within Hegel's phenomenology? It's the second to last section, the one right before this absolute knowing section. On the other hand, Hegel is not, deluded about the fact that religion is there in as far as we can go back in history. So it's part of the matrix in which human beings develop. And we can keep in mind both of these senses. Now remember, the religion section was itself tracing out the development of religious consciousness, self-consciousness, connected together, culminating in what Hegel calls the ultimate form of religion, which is Christianity. And of course, for Hegel, it's not, Eastern Orthodoxy or Catholicism. It's going to be Protestant Christianity. He doesn't talk about that so much in this work, but in, for example, the lectures on the philosophy of history or the lectures on the philosophy of religion, he's pretty clear about that. So anyway, religious community, right? So he says the religious community, so far as it is at first the substance, that's a term that he's using throughout here quite a bit, the substance of absolute spirit. So what it is that absolute spirit is, we could say in itself, right? The religious community is that from the beginning, but that this is in a somewhat developed state. We remember that the religious community is organizing itself and understanding itself through Vorstellung, not through Begriff or concept, or as Miller translates it, notion. So the religious community is the uncultivated Rohe consciousness whose existence is all the harsher and more barbarous the deeper its inner spirit is. And the deeper its spirit is, the harder the task that it's torpid. Now notice this term, self, right? So we've got this contrast happening here between substance and self. The harder the task, the labor that its torpid self has with its essence, with the alien content of its consciousness. So what is Hegel talking about there? Well, in religion, not just in the religion section, but in the places where religion has come up within the phenomenology earlier. For example, in the self-consciousness section, where the culmination of it was the unhappy consciousness, which is the largest section in that portion of the work, and then later on in the spirit section, where we have several different forms of religion coming up, that of the community and the family, right? This contrast that is summarized perhaps in the Antigone, later on with faith and its struggle with enlightenment, and we can go on and on and on, right? So there's an alienation, a Fremdsein, that is taking place. And, it's interesting. He also talks about an Äußerung, right? Externalization. And there is within spirit, within the self-consciousness, kind of a split, right? If we think back to the unhappy consciousness, totally about this alienation that's going on. And he says, why is this? Because in religion, the spirit is located deeper and deeper and deeper. You got to do work to bring it out. So, this is part of what is attractive about religion, I think, for a lot of people. I'll just give you one funny example from my own past, which is very specific. I used to go to the Newman Center, which is a place where Catholic students can go at secular universities. And I'd encounter these people who were all about the Latin Mass. And I knew that none of these people actually knew Latin. And they didn't even have missals to follow along with it. Like my, old ancestors did. My family is Francophone as well as Anglophone. So I've got like an old missal that my great-grandmother had where it's the Mass in Latin and then, French, so you can figure out what the hell's actually being said. And there were many of these. And I'd talk with these people and I'd say, they'd be like, oh, I went to a Latin Mass. It was so amazing, so great, so beautiful, so, transcendent. And I'd be like, yeah, but you don't actually know Latin, so you don't know what the hell's being said. And they'd say, exactly. That's what makes it feel so spiritual. And I'd be like, that's the opposite of what's supposed to be going on. From a Hegelian perspective, right, that would be complete nonsense. This is not even mysticism. It's just silliness. But you got to dig. You got to dig in religion to figure out where spirit is actually located. So he says, not until consciousness has given up hope of overcoming, of Aufheben, right, that alienation. Now, what does it give up its hope, its Hoffnung, of? Not of overcoming the alienation totally, but of the modality of overcoming that alienation. There's a right way, in this case, to overcome alienation, and there's a less productive, perhaps even counterproductive way of doing so that just kicks the alienation can down the road, if you know that expression of kicking the can down the road, relocating it further into the process. So he talks about giving up hope of overcoming that alienation in an external, that is alien manner, an external or fremd, not what you need. Overcoming alienation is not going to be done by adding more alienation. Then he says it turns to itself because the overcoming of that alienation, the actual Aufhebung, is a return, a Rückkehr, to self-consciousness. And so we could say, okay, no longer just consciousness, self-consciousness, great. We've done this Hegelian transition so many times. The whole religion section was supposed to be about the reconciliation of consciousness and self-consciousness. Cool. Well, self-consciousness exists with a world, not just all by itself, not just as necessarily involved with other self-consciousnesses, as we saw back in the self-consciousness section, and as we saw throughout the rest of the phenomenology, but also with a world. And that's a world that includes other people, and that's a world that has a history, as we're going to see, right? An actual world isn't just a bunch of stuff all thrown together. It coheres, and it changes over time. So we're going to come to that in just a moment. So not until then does it turn to its own present world, right? And discover it as its property, its Eigentum. Ooh, this is very interesting, isn't it, to see Hegel using this term, property? The world becomes its own, what belongs to the self-consciousness. I mean, can the world really belong to a self-consciousness? Strictly speaking, no, because the world is owned in parts and parcels by all sorts of people. If we're thinking about legal property, right? I mean, at one time, the world had a lot of blank spots where somebody could come along and plunk a household down and say, this is my property now. I mean, now just about everything is owned, if not by individuals, but by governments. But Hegel's not just talking about legal ownership here. He's talking about appropriating the world as a self-consciousness. I mean, in this sense, so take a museum, for example. It is owned by, probably the museum organization or perhaps the city that the museum is in. But we all own it, at least in part, every time that we go in and participate in the observation, which is a term we're going to use in just a moment, of the various matters that are on display, curated for us, right? This is why people can tick us off. We can be like, oh, I wanted to have a nice quiet picnic at the park, and these people are playing music over here and grilling, and I don't like the smell of their food that they're cooking. Well, I mean, it's shared property, right? So coming back to Hegel after those examples, he says, not until then. Oh, well, let's talk about this. So the overcoming of that alienation is the return into self-consciousness. Not until then does it turn to its own present world and discover its property, thus taking the first step of coming down out of the, now notice what he says, intellectual world, intellektuelle Welt, or rather towards quickening the abstract element of that world with the actual self, the wirkliche Selbst, the self that, has a body, a location in time, is moving through time, has a certain amount of money in their bank account, wears certain clothes, all of these things that differentiate and individuate us. So how does this take place? Well, he talks about several different things that are actually happening in the reason and the spirit section. So observation, he says, through observation it finds on the one hand existence, Dasein, in the shape of thought and comprehends it, and conversely in its thinking and comprehends existence. So this is talking about what happened in the very first part of the reason section, which is actually quite long. There's a lot of stuff going on in there, going all the way from, sort of the science of the time, which Hegel's kind of, it's not stuff that we necessarily buy into now, through all the way to phrenology and physiognomy, right? And trying to observe living things, trying to make sense of them. And we're the ones who do that. We are the self-consciousnesses. We are the spirits that do that. And so what is this going to lead us to? This is going to lead us to a connection, or as we're going to say, the immediate, unmittelbares, unity, Einheit, of thought and being. As he's going to call it, the unity of abstract essence and the self, and it expresses this abstractly. Now, he's coming back to the religion section. The very first thing that we looked at was natural religion, right? And now we didn't begin just with light. There's all different possibilities for the natural religion section. But the purest of them is the religion of light, which Hegel, mistakenly presents as if it's Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism historically much more complex than that, but you can see what he's saying here. So when it is expressed the primal light in a pure form, and what is that going to be? A unity of extension and being, right? And so what is that? Being understood, the being that we encounter, understood through measure, through extension. Should point out that for Hegel, anything that you can measure and quantify is at kind of a lower level than things that are more reflexively intense, like qualities, right? So, saying that something is extension is not, making it very valuable, right? So he says extension is a simple unity which more nearly resembles pure thought than light does, and in doing this, it has revived in thought the substance of the East, right, where the sun begins, right? And then he says, interestingly, spirit at once recoils in horror from the abstract unity. There's something about pure abstractions that do entice people in, and they're like, oh, this is awesome. But then when we look at them, we're like, no, that is not enough for me. That's lacking determinate meaning. I don't know how to apply this in my actual life. It sounds really awesome, but what the hell am I, this complicated self-consciousness? What the hell am I supposed to do with this in an actual world, as an actual self? So he says, what is it recoiling in horror from? Selfless substantiality. And against it, what does it do? It affirms individuality, right? Einzelheit. Being an actual person. This is tied in with Wirklichkeit, with actuality. So what is that like? So now we get to culture, individuality and culture coming in the spirit section, late in the spirit section, actually. So he says, only after it's externalized this individuality in the sphere of culture, thereby giving it an existence, a Dasein, and establishing it throughout the whole of existence, only after spirit, how do we determinately express this, has arrived at the thought of utility, Nützlichkeit. This is something that Hegel discusses at considerable length in the spirit section, and he is trying to capture the movement of thought within the intellectual world and the actual world of the time leading up to him. I mean, keep in mind that if we want to talk about utility, utilitarianism as an actual philosophy, organized by and articulated as such by Jeremy Bentham, is not that distant from Hegel. Jeremy Bentham is writing in the late 18th and early 19th century, at the time that Hegel himself is on the scene. But Bentham is putting together modes of thinking that have been kicked around for 200 years in very active ways in the various enlightenments or Aufklärungs that have taken place. David Hume talks about utility quite a lot. Shaftesbury, all these French encyclopedists that are dominating the 18th century that Hegel's read, well, they're all talking about utility. And this is a very important way of changing the world that we're in. So, individuality and utility, right? Culture. And then he goes on and talks about only after spirit has arrived at the thought of utility and in its absolute freedom. So this is getting towards freedom and the terror that we're going to find, which then transitions us into other discussions. Only after that does it turn the thought of its inmost steps outward and enunciate essence as I equals I. And then he goes on and says, but this I equals I is the movement which reflects itself into itself. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what does... Hegel's used this formula a lot, I equals I, right? Ich, equals is gleich, is equivalent to itself. Should this be understood as a mere repetition? Like hand is hand, right? As a tautology? Well, that would be abstract. And that is a possibility. But we're going to see that that's not all that's going on here. Can't be all that's going on. That would be a trap. That would lead us off of the path and not get us to the end of absolute knowing. That would just lead us into another spiral, into a cul-de-sac that we wind up finishing our quest in without being satisfied. So what does it really mean? Hegel's going to tell us in a couple different points. Here's the first one. This I equals I is the movement which reflects itself into itself. Since this identity, being absolute negativity, is absolute difference. So notice, identity, absolute negativity, absolute difference. The self-identity of the I, Selbstgleichheit, right? And so identity here, Gleichheit, can also mean equivalence, can also mean, corresponding to. I think we should understand it in a more robust manner, as I've mentioned in earlier commentaries. So it stands against this pure difference, right? The self-identity of the I stands over against this pure difference, which as pure and at the same time objective, gegenständlich, to the self-knowing self has to be expressed. Now we get to something else. Time. So just as previously essence was declared to be the unity of thought and extension, was it? It was the unity of extension and being, and now Hegel says, well, it was the unity of thought and extension, and we could say, well, I by the transitive property or something, since thought and being are in a unity, then if being and extension are in a unity, then thought and extension must also be in that unity, right? Okay, that's fine. But now we have a transition to thought and time. That's different. You could think of time as merely another kind of extension, which is what we do when we're, mathematically modeling thing, or just talking about time as being the fourth dimension, right? But Hegel thinks that time is different than that. He says the difference left to itself, unresting and unhalting time, it collapses into itself, within itself. It is the objective repose of extension, while extension is pure identity with itself, the I. Now, that is something kind of bizarre to say, right? When we think of extension, so this is a technical term, we're thinking about space and things that are in space. Are they the I? Well, you and I exist in space, right? This body that I, however we want to understand it, I'm working through, carry around with myself and my soul, is me, whatever we make of my body, that's extension. Very complicated extension, too. But what about external things, like, this chalkboard that I've written all these nice diagrams on and notes? Does that have a self? It's not conscious, right? So how is that supposed to be an I that equals I? Well, it's not. It's an I. It's a thing existing for this I, me, and the I that is you. So let's go on with this, right? He says, the I, the ich, which is equal to itself, is not merely the self, but the identity, the Gleichheit, once again, right, of the self with itself, of the Selbst mit sich selbst, formula that he's going to use, again, just in a moment. And he says this identity is complete, vollkommene. Okay, so complete, think of not in sense of like ticking off a bunch of boxes or couldn't be any better, but rather at the end of a process of development, of coming to fruition, right? So it's complete and unmediated, unmittelbar, oneness, Einheit, with the self. Now, Miller's translation here, just a little bit lacking in nuance. It's not, I mean, technically speaking, yes, it is complete and unmediated unity with the self, right? The self that is the I. But he's actually saying unmediated oneness with its own self, mit sich selbst. And this means that the unity, it's not simple unity, right? It may be unmediated at this stage, although, as we know, nothing is ever truly unmediated for Hegel, but there's actually a duality, at least, within the self. So, we go on, and he's going to unpack this a bit more. What is a way of understanding this identity, complete and immediate oneness with the self? This subject is just as much substance. Okay, so we got self, spirit, substance, and subject, the four S's that Hegel often plays around with. So the self engages with substance, is a substance. But it can't just be a substance, because a substance is something, it's not just that a substance is inert, because many substances are quite active and do things. It's that a substance that is lacking subjectivity is just a substance. And the self can't be that kind of substance, can it? Nor can the absolute spirit that was grasped originally through religion be something that's merely substance. It also has to be subject. So, what does he say here? Substance just by itself would be intuition, Anschauung, devoid of content, or the intuition of a content which, as determinate, would be only accidental. And there he actually uses a cognate term, accidental, and would lack necessity, Notwendigkeit. It would just be contingent. It would just show up and wouldn't have any meaning outside of itself. It might be something that we want to eat or appreciate, but it wouldn't have any greater connection or meaning. Substance. So substance would be just abstract in this case. And he says substance would pass through the absolute only insofar as it was thought or intuited as absolute unity. So it would include everything, right? And all content would, as regards its diversity, have to fall outside of it in reflection. Reflection, which is what self-consciousness does. So if there's some substance, and that's the be-all and end-all, and I'm not it, and it doesn't really do much of anything, and I'm the one thinking about it, engaging in reflection, there's something, let's say, substantial that's not in that substance, which means that it's not really what it pretends to be, the, substance of absolute knowing, however we want to put it. We better be involved in it somehow. It better encompass us, and in a way that allows us to, maintain ourselves as individual self-consciousnesses. I mean, Hegel doesn't think that the end of the process is all of us in some mystical fusion with some primal unity, and then we just hang out and, take it in, man. He's not a hippie or, some Zen bum or something like that. I mean, real Zen is not like the portrayal that we see in popular culture anyway. It's actually kind of complicated. Hegel's not for that. The substance had better not be the end of the story. And that reflection, like he says, reflection does not pertain to substance. Why? Because substance would not be subject. What is reflection? It's, thinking about oneself. It's thinking about what you're related to. It's taking a higher stand in your understanding, your cognition, your whatever we're going to talk about, your thinking. So he says, substance would not be subject, would not be grasped as reflecting on itself and reflecting itself into itself, would not be grasped as spirit. Spirit, when it's really spirit and not just sort of its dead bones, the stuff that happened along the way, left there behind us, aufgehobene, right? Spirit is reflection. It involves reflection. It takes the self and it takes the substance and it brings them together in some way that isn't totally unmediated either. So Hegel goes on. And he says, if a content were to be spoken of anyway, it would, on the one hand, only be spoken of in order to cast it into the empty abyss of the absolute. Hegel doesn't want the absolute to be understood as an empty abyss, as something that's beyond communication about it, beyond conceptualization of it, right? That's a false absolute. And then he says, on the other, it would be a content picked up in external fashion from sense perception, just grasping something contingent within the world. Neither of these are good options from a Hegelian perspective. So he says, knowledge would seem to have come by things, by what is different from itself, right? An alienation that takes place, and by the difference of a variety of things without comprehending how and whence they came. So this is charting out for us don't go down this path. We need to do something else. And this is what's going to happen in the few paragraphs that we still have left to come, explaining how all of this comes together. And we should remind ourselves as we finish this up, Hegel thinks that this actually does happen through a historical process in which spirit unfolds itself, develops in very complicated ways that we then ourselves can go back as phenomenologists and as people involved in these processes, informed by these processes yourself. And he thinks that he's charted out the significant portions of this development here in the Phenomenology of Spirit. I did say that was the last thing, but I will say one other further thing as well. We shouldn't take what is being laid out for us in the Phenomenology of Spirit as the absolute final word from Hegel on this, because he did write other books. He goes on and provides all these lectures to his students, which add to the picture. So if we're thinking about the historical process, lectures on the philosophy of history, lectures on the history of philosophy, both incredibly important, right? And we learn some things about this process on the way. But this is enough for right now. So we've gotten through this massive paragraph. Now we can start making some more forward progress to the absolute knowing final endpoint.